So let's talk about promises. So promises in JavaScript and any other language really are used when you have one bit of code that will only work when another bit of code is finished. So it needs to wait for that to finish. They're called promises because quite simply, the bit of code is promising that it will return some value. If it doesn't, and it breaks that promise, I guess, it's rejected. They can be quite daunting, especially for beginners, but they're really not that difficult. Let's take a look. So you can create a promise like you can any other object or function, for example. We can say const my promise equals new promise, okay? And a promise takes and executes a function. It's just a function which has two parameters, a resolve and a reject parameter. So I'll put my function block in there. And basically, when the promise is finished, it will resolve. If it breaks it for some reason, if it can't finish, it will reject it. So for example, if we just resolve this promise and say hello, and then we can execute this promise by saying my promise and then dot then. And inside there, we'll put a callback function, console.log, done. Okay, real simple. So what this means is when the promise resolves, it will hit this then block. So if we save that and run it, you'll see we have done in the console here because the promise has fulfilled, it's resolved. Now, when a promise resolves, it will pass in any values you want, and then those values are accessible inside this this then block. So for example, we can get a message from that, and then instead of that, we can just output the message. So anything that is passed in from the resolution will be output there. Okay, but a promise might not resolve. It might also reject. So what happens there? Well, if a promise rejects, it will go to a catch block. We can catch that, catch. And inside there, it works in the exact same way. We have a callback function, console.log, error, like that. And now instead of resolving that, if we reject it, we're accessing this reject parameter. The promise has failed, it's rejected. So we know something's gone wrong. Now, much like when we resolve, any value passed in is accessible in there. So for example, something went wrong, we can access that here, error, and instead of that, we can just log error like that, and we'll see something went wrong there. So when you have a promise like this, you use a then block to define some code you want to execute when the promise resolves, and use a catch block to define some code that you want to execute when the promise rejects. So I know this is a trivial example, but bear with me. A more realistic use case would probably be to have a function which returns a promise. So my function, so I've got a function here, and what I'll do is just say that this function returns a promise like this. And inside there, we'll have a resolve and reject parameter, just like we did before. And now we can use this function in the same kind of way. Instead of my promise there, I'll get rid of that my promise, in fact. I'll just have my function. So I'm calling this function, and we're saying once the function resolves, do this, and if it fails, do that. So maybe this function takes a name parameter, and we can say if name, so if the name has a value, we will resolve with hello and then name. But underneath that, we'll just put an else block, and we'll say reject no name value set. So basically we're saying if there's a name value passed in, we'll resolve. If not, we'll just reject. So if I pass a name value into this function, Reese, you'll see in the console, hello Reese. If we don't pass a name value in, like that, and I run it again, you'll see it failed and we got this no name value set. You can also chain these then blocks. So where we have this then block, we can have another one, then like this, and then do something else. And you can chain then blocks like this. So console.log, how are you, like that. And if I refresh this, I need to pass a name value in there. So if I refresh this, you'll see, hello Reese, how are you? So it's done basically executing these then blocks in order. So I'll do this one first, and then when that's done, it will do this one. And if any of them throw, they'll go straight to the catch block. So if you have code which depends on the last bit of code finishing, you can chain them together. So like I said, this is all very trivial. Let me comment this out for a sec and show you a more realistic example. So this one here, I've just got a bit of code which does some translation. It calls a Google Translate API and basically converts some text to Spanish, I think. So what I'm going to do is uncomment this code I wrote earlier. Basically, all we're doing is calling this function, okay, this code here. Don't worry about how this works. It essentially just goes to the translation API and makes the translation. And we're saying that once it's translated, then what we're going to do is log the result from this. So if I save that and refresh this, we get the translation. But of course, we can't log this until it's translated, which is why we're doing it in this dem block. And because this is some external API, this could fail for any reason. Like this endpoint might be down, or maybe our internet's not working. Any number of reasons, this may end up throwing an error, and that's nothing to do with us. So we might not be able to control when this fails. So basically, we just need to be prepared for when this fails. So a more realistic way of using this would probably be, once you've got the translation, we output it to the user, whereas if it fails, we'd need to show some error message or error UI. But whether we show the translation to the user or the error UI, both of those depend on that Google Translate code finishing in some way, which is why we make use of promises here. So promises really aren't that complicated. They're just used when you have a bit of code which needs one bit of code to finish before it can do something, whether it errors or succeed, it doesn't matter. All right, now that you're experts on promises, you should go and watch my other video on the async and await keywords. It'll take you less than 5 minutes, but it will show you how you can take this promise-based code and make it a whole lot cleaner, a whole lot easier to follow. It's a super short video. What else you got going on today? You can go watch Netflix? Come on.